Yeah. As echoed by other panelists, thank you for convening this conversation. And, um, I want to acknowledge and ground all of this in the fact that this is so challenging for a lot of people, and people are really trying their best. And parents and educators and school staff are doing so much and have adapted in such remarkable ways. Let me say a little about the alliance, right? So Eros is a national coalition that brings together educators, parents, students, school staff, and the organizations or unions that represent those constituencies. And together we work to craft a collective agenda for the schools our communities deserve. It has been some time now since parents and community leaders and educators, including the AFT, have been calling for what people have termed sustainable community schools. And in community schools, a lot of what we laid out years ago in terms of what schools should look like and how they should function are re-emerging as part of the conversation around how we reopen post-COVID-19, right? And so in my conversation with parents and parent organizers and those who work directly with young people, the things that have come up in this conversation around reopening reflect some of what have already been said, but I'll sort of reiterate them. So one, I think for a lot of parents I've talked with and young people, one of the first things that people say when we talk about safely reopening schools is that safety cannot and should not mean the expansion of law enforcement, right? So often in this country, when we think of safety, we think more police, we think more law enforcement. And regrettably, we've seen, even in the last few days, what that means, particularly for young folks of color. And so people are saying, hey, as we talk about safety, let this not be a nod to more police in our schools and dragging people up buses to make sure they have masks. But let's have a conversation around the ways in which safety is connected to adequate resources. So just today, in partnership with the AFT, Eros launched the campaign to pass the HEROES Act, which is really about how do we make sure that state and local government and school districts have the resources they need. And as Randy indicated, we're also aware that even if passed, the HEROES Act still comes a little bit shy of what we think is actually needed. And one of the things that parents say is that we are aware that we live in the richest country in the world. And so some of what Linda has named in terms of what Singapore and other places are doing, we are capable of doing that in the United States. It is not a question of whether we have the resources, but it is a matter of whether or not we have the political will to do what is necessary to make our community safe, right? So one, we don't want safety to mean more police, more law enforcement. Two, safety has to be grounded in expanded resources. So money, technology. How do we bridge the technology divide? How do we make sure that communities of color and poor communities are being equitably invested in, right? The third thing that parents and community lift up is this idea of equity. That when we think about the coronavirus and what it has done and what it continues to do, there are racial implications. There are economic implications, right? And so poor people, Black people, brown people, people who speak English as a second language, there are ways in which the impact has been acute in those communities. And so as we talk about reopening, what parents and students are saying is, let us examine the impact and the needs of those communities as the starting point for the conversation around what we all need, right? That if we address the most vulnerable in our society, we might find ways to deal with the larger social concerns. The fourth thing, and this is a shout out again to the work that people have been doing around expanding sustainable community schools, is that instead of more police and more law enforcement, we need more school nurses. Right? We need more medical professionals on hand, not just to address someone who may be coming into a building with a fever, but people who will train young people, who will train school staff on proper protocol for keeping us safe, right? So how do we expand the presence of school staff and medical professionals and personnel so that we can have the information that we need? The other thing that comes up is this notion of collective decision making, that if I am a parent with a school-age child, I do not want to be left out of how the decisions to reopen are made. And so around the country, another thing that Eros, in connection to AFT and our other union partners, is leading, and Journey for Justice, is that we're building local alliances, right? And we're saying we're encouraging people to build local task forces that can lay out a plan for what equitable reopening looks like, and then develop actions that can lead to that. And then, shout out to to Jackie, the medical person. We're also saying, as we talk about reopening, we cannot ignore the science, right? So I live in Georgia, and on a daily basis, I feel like I'm torn in two worlds, because I look at the rest of the country and I look at what's happening here, and I'm like, why are we ignoring what we know? There are certain things we already know, and while it is evolving, we know that social distancing is effective. We know that masks are necessary. We know that a space in between. There are things that we know. We know that resources are needed, right? And when we reopen, we cannot do so in a way that ignores all of the information we have already gathered, and an attempt to return to what life was in January. Parents and community and students are saying there is a way forward. That way has to be rooted in equity, has to be rooted in collective decision-making, has to be rooted in the resources that we need, the money that we need, and we can actually afford it. We actually can. So those are the things I'm hearing from parents and students and community members through our work at Eros.